The church smelled of lilies and polished wood, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes and follows you home like an unwanted shadow. Outside, the Texas sun blazed as if mocking the darkness in my heart. People gathered in clusters, speaking in hushed voices, their eyes darting toward me and then quickly away, as though grief was contagious. I sat in the front pew, my hands clasped so tightly that the tips of my fingers turned pale. It had been only 3 days since George had taken his last breath, and I was still learning how to exist without the sound of his voice in the house. 52 years together, and now there was only silence. The kind of silence that pressed against your chest and made breathing feel like an effort. I thought I had prepared myself. George had been sick for months, each day a little weaker, each night his hand gripping mine a little less firmly. But no matter how many times you watch the clock tick toward the inevitable, the moment it comes, it tears you in ways you never imagined. The minister's words floated over me like a distant hum. Something about eternal rest. Something about faith. And the hope of seeing each other again. I heard the words, but they could not touch the storm inside me. My eyes wandered to the casket at the front. It was mahogany polished to a deep shine, and lined with white satin. George had always liked rich wood tones. He would have approved. That thought, small as it was, gave me an odd sense of comfort. People filed past to pay their respects, one by one. Some patted my shoulder, others squeezed my hand, murmuring the same lines I had heard all morning. "I'm so sorry for your loss. He was a good man. You were lucky to have each other." Lucky. That word felt like a shard of glass in my chest. Lucky to have him, yes, but what about now that I did not? And then, in the middle of the slow procession, I saw him, my son, Daniel, my only child. He was dressed in a dark suit, his tie slightly crooked, his face expressionless. He had been distant these past few months, visiting George only once or twice, claiming work and family obligations. I had told myself not to resent it. Life gets busy. People cope in their own ways. But now, seeing him approach, I could not help but feel the sting of all the moments he had not been there. He reached my pew and bent down, his lips close to my ear. His voice was calm, but each word was coated with something sharp. "You're nothing without Dad." It was not a whisper of sympathy. It was not grief talking. It was deliberate, cold. For a moment, my mind refused to register it. I stared at him, searching for a flicker of remorse in his eyes, but found none. I felt my breath catch. And then, in a way I still cannot explain, something inside me shifted. I should have cried. I should have broken. But instead, an unexpected laugh rose from my chest, short, sharp, and utterly unplanned. His eyes widened, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through his mask. The sound of my laugh hung in the air between us, heavy and strange. I could feel the stares from the people around us. It was not the kind of laugh you let out at a funeral. It was the kind of laugh that says, "You think you know me, but you have no idea." Daniel straightened, his jaw tightening. I could tell he had not expected that reaction. For years, he had treated me as though my identity began and ended with being George's wife, as though without him, I would crumble into nothing. But George had known better. George had seen me in my entirety, the woman I had been before marriage, the battles I had fought silently, the strength I had drawn from places even I did not know existed. I sat through the rest of the service with a stillness that was not quite peace, but something close. Every word from the pulpit, every hymn sung, every sniffle and creak of the wooden pews seemed sharper now. I realized that George's passing, as shattering as it was, had left me with something unexpected, a mirror held up to my own life. When the service ended, people lined up again to offer condolences. I nodded politely, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept replaying Daniel's words and my own laughter in response. The more I thought about it, the more I realized it had not been madness. It had been recognition. A recognition that I was still here, still standing, and perhaps about to learn who I was without George beside me. Outside, the sun was still blazing, and the air was thick with the scent of warm earth and flowers. People drifted toward their cars, voices low and heads bowed. I felt the weight of eyes on me, But for the first time in days, I did not care. Daniel was standing near the church steps, speaking with his wife, Emily. She glanced at me once, quickly, then looked away. I could not tell if it was guilt, pity, or something else in her expression. As I walked past them, Daniel opened his mouth as if to speak, but I did not stop. I simply kept walking, the gravel crunching under my shoes, the heat pressing down, my mind already moving forward. I knew one thing for certain: the words he had spoken to me today were not going to be the end of this story. They were the beginning, and whatever came next, I would not face it as the woman he thought I was. The night after the funeral, the house was still filled with the smell of flowers and the faint traces of perfume from relatives who had hugged me hours earlier. I sat in the living room, the black dress still clinging to my body, my hair stiff with hairspray. The quiet felt almost violent after the day's noise. For the first time in 40 years, I was in this house without my husband's heartbeat somewhere within its walls. My son's words echoed in my mind. "You're nothing without Dad." It was not grief that made my stomach twist. It was the way he said it, flat, almost like a fact carved into stone. No comfort, no hesitation, just an ice-cold truth he seemed eager for me to swallow. The phone rang on the side table, its shrill sound pulling me from the haze. It was Clara, my neighbor. She had been at the funeral, her eyes red from crying. Though she had only met my husband a few times. "Mary, I just wanted to check in," she said gently. "How are you holding up?" I forced a laugh, though it came out brittle. "Oh, you know me. I hold up better than I should." But Clara hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I saw the way your son spoke to you today. It didn't feel right." The air felt heavier. I had told myself I was overthinking, that maybe I'd misheard him in the church. But Clara's words confirmed the sharpness in his tone was not just in my imagination. "Clara," I said, "what did you hear exactly?" She was quiet for a moment before saying, "It wasn't just the words. It was how he looked at you. Like you were an inconvenience." I thanked her and ended the call, but the seed had been planted. Later that night, I found myself in my husband's office, a room I had not dared to enter since his passing. His scent still lingered in the leather chair, in the books lining the shelves. I sat down and let my fingers rest on the desk where he had spent countless hours. A photograph of us from 20 years ago smiled back at me. We looked younger, certain of our place in each other's lives. As I stared at it, my mind wandered to the years before my husband's illness. I had always been the glue, the quiet engine behind our family. I cooked, I kept the house running, I supported my husband's work, I raised our son. Yet somehow, my boy had grown to see his father as the pillar and me as the shadow. The next morning, I made coffee and sat by the kitchen window, watching the early light creep over the lawn. My son had stayed in the guest room after the funeral, and when he came downstairs, his expression was as guarded as the night before. "Morning," I said. He grunted, pouring himself coffee without looking at me. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," I told him, my voice calm but firm. He froze for a second, then looked over his shoulder with a half smirk. "What about it? You told me I was nothing without your father. Do you really believe that?" He shrugged. "I just meant you've never lived alone before. Dad took care of everything. I don't know how you're going to manage without him." The words hit like a slap. "So you think I'm helpless?" I asked. "I think you've been sheltered," he replied. "It's not an insult, Mom. It's just reality." That was the moment I realized something had shifted. This was not just about grief or clumsy words. This was about power. My husband's absence had created a vacuum, and my son was already deciding how I would fit into the new order. That afternoon, while he went out to meet a friend, I pulled out my old ledger from the kitchen cabinet. It had every grocery list, bill, and household repair logged for decades. I ran my fingers over the pages, remembering the times I had stretched a dollar, negotiated with contractors, fixed broken appliances, with nothing but determination and a YouTube tutorial. Helpless? No. Invisible? Maybe, but not helpless. When my son returned, he found me at the dining table surrounded by papers, my reading glasses perched on my nose. "What's all this?" he asked. Your father didn't take care of everything, I said, without looking up. I did, he smirked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. That was the first crack in his confidence. And I knew then the days ahead would not be about mourning alone. They would be about proving to him and maybe to myself that I was far from nothing. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the pot of stew simmering on the stove. The smell of beef, carrots, and potatoes rose in the air, familiar and grounding. My husband, John, used to call it my Sunday miracle stew, even though today was Wednesday. I had made it without thinking, as if my hands remembered a life where he was still here, coming home at 6, hungry and smiling. The house was too quiet. Quiet in a way that felt like it had teeth. It bit at the edges of my mind, reminding me that the person who used to fill it with warmth and laughter was now lying in the ground. My son, David, had not been home since the funeral. Not once. No phone calls. No messages. Only a cold, lingering echo of his words at the cemetery, words that had lodged in my chest like a shard of broken glass. You're nothing without Dad. I had laughed then, more out of shock than anything else. I could still see the way his face had drained of color, as if he had expected me to crumble on the spot. But I didn't. I couldn't give him that satisfaction. Today, though, the weight of it pressed harder than usual. I stirred the stew and thought of him as a boy, chubby cheeks, messy hair, running through this very kitchen with a toy car in his hand, asking me to watch him do another amazing trick. Back then, I believed love alone was enough to raise a child into kindness. I believed in the slow, steady work of motherhood, in the sacrifices you make without thinking twice. But somewhere between then and now, something had gone wrong. And it wasn't just grief that had turned my son into someone who could stand at his father's grave and cut his mother down. It was deeper, older, and if I was honest, it had been growing for years. I set the spoon down and wiped my hands on my apron. The phone sat on the counter, black screen staring at me like an accusation. I wanted to call him. I wanted to demand an explanation for that moment at the funeral. But I also knew he would twist the conversation into something ugly. He was good at that. Too good. Instead, I picked up the framed photo leaning against the wall. John, David, and me at David's college graduation. David's arm was around his father's shoulders, but not mine. I had brushed it off back then, told myself it was just a candid moment. But now, I wondered if it had been deliberate. The doorbell rang, my heart jolted. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find Sarah, my neighbor from 2 houses down, standing there with a tentative smile and a plate of banana bread in her hands. I just thought you might need some company, she said softly. I invited her in, and soon we were sitting at the kitchen table, the bread between us. She talked about small things, at first the weather, her garden, a sale at the grocery store. But then her eyes softened, and she leaned forward. I was at the funeral, she said. I heard what David said to you. I froze, my hand tightening around my mug of tea. I don't know what happened between you two, she continued. But I need you to know that everyone saw it. And they saw you stand there unshaken. You were stronger than most people could have been. I wanted to tell her that strength was a performance, that inside I had been crumbling like wet paper. But instead, I just nodded. Then Sarah hesitated, glancing toward the door as if she was about to leave, but thought better of it. There's something else, she said. After the service, I overheard David talking to a few people. He said you wouldn't be able to manage on your own, that without John, you'd probably fall apart in a few months. He made it sound like he was already preparing to take over things. Her words landed like a punch. Take over things. I thought of the house, the savings account, the small amount of land John and I had bought together in the early years. Was David circling me like a vulture, waiting for weakness? When Sarah left, the house felt even colder. I turned off the stew, no longer hungry. My mind was on fire with possibilities, questions, and a growing sense of unease. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me think of footsteps. Every shadow felt like a presence. I finally got out of bed and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the moonlight spilling across the floor. I had spent years believing David's distance was a phase, something time and patience would mend. But now I began to wonder if it was something far more dangerous, if my son didn't just see me as irrelevant without his father, but as an obstacle standing in the way of something he wanted. And if that was true, then I needed to be ready for whatever was coming. The week after the funeral was not marked by tears as much as by a strange kind of stillness. It was the kind of silence that hums in your ears when there's too much to think about and not enough strength to think it through. I stayed in my bedroom most of the time, not out of grief alone, but because stepping outside meant facing the pitying eyes of neighbors and the whispering voices that carried news faster than the Texas wind. On the morning of the 7th day, I woke before dawn. The air smelled faintly of rain, the kind that comes in quick bursts here in our small Texas town. The house was darker than usual, shadows stretching across the hallway as I walked toward the study. My husband's study. That room had been his sanctuary. I rarely stepped inside when he was alive, not because I wasn't welcome, but because I felt like an intruder among his things. Bookshelves lined the walls, heavy with thick volumes on history, engineering, and farming manuals from decades past. His desk stood in the middle of the room, sturdy oak, with a leather chair behind it. It still smelled faintly of the tobacco he smoked in his pipe every Friday evening. I don't know what drew me to that desk. Maybe it was the fact that my son's words at the funeral were still stuck in my mind like a thorn. "You're nothing without Dad." He had said it like it was truth, not just cruelty. It wasn't just the insult that stung, it was the certainty in his voice, the way his eyes seemed to strip away my worth in front of everyone. I opened the top drawer of the desk and found exactly what I expected: pens, pencils, old receipts, and a scattering of paper clips. I was about to close it when my fingers brushed against something at the very back. It was a folded envelope, yellowed slightly with age. My name was written on the front in my husband's handwriting, the strong, slanted letters I had memorized over decades of grocery lists and birthday cards. I sat down in his chair before I could trust my legs to hold me. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, dated 6 months before he died. "My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I have gone on before you. I want to tell you something you must never forget, no matter what others say. You have been the backbone of this family. You built the home I was proud to come back to every night. You raised our boy with more patience than I could have ever given, and you have always been more than enough. I know our son has grown stubborn. I see him talking over you, dismissing your words. I have tried to guide him, but perhaps I have failed in that. Still, remember, his blindness to your strength does not make you weak. When I am gone, you will be the one holding this family together, whether he realizes it or not. I trust you, Margaret. I believe in you, and I love you beyond the end of time. Yours always, Thomas.by. The time I reached the last word, my hands were trembling. Tears blurred the ink, and I pressed the letter against my chest. It felt like his arms were around me again, holding me steady. The morning light began to creep into the room, casting gold across the desk. That was when something shifted inside me. My son's voice from the funeral tried to echo in my head, but it no longer had the same power. Because I knew the truth now. I had the proof in my hands, written in the very hand of the man who had known me better than anyone ever could. I folded the letter carefully and put it back into the envelope. It was not going to be hidden away again. This was my shield, my reminder, my proof that my life's worth was not measured by my son's words. The door to the study creaked open behind me, and I turned to see Michael standing there. His eyes darted to the letter, then to my face. "What's that?" he asked, his voice sharp, almost defensive. "Something your father left for me," I said evenly. He stepped inside, his boots making a dull thud on the wooden floor. "You're digging through his things already?" I held his gaze. "I'm finding what belongs to me." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might say something cruel again. But instead, he looked away and muttered, "It's just a letter. Doesn't change anything." I wanted to tell him that it changed everything, that it was the difference between being crushed and standing tall. But I didn't waste my breath. The proof was in the way I no longer felt the urge to hide from him. When he left the room, I stayed seated in that leather chair, running my fingers over the words in the letter. Thomas had seen me. He had known my worth even when others refused. 2. And that, I realized, was the kind of truth no funeral speech could erase. That morning, I made myself a promise. I would not let grief turn into surrender. I would not let my son's coldness define my days. And I would make sure that before this was over, he would understand exactly who he had underestimated. I woke the next morning with sunlight slicing through the blinds and a strange heaviness pressing on my chest. It was not grief in its rawest form anymore. It was something else. A slow, simmering question had been boiling inside me since the funeral. Why had my son, my own flesh and blood, looked at me with contempt on the day we laid his father to rest? The words kept circling back, stabbing fresh wounds every time they replayed. "You're nothing without Dad." He had spat them with such conviction that for a moment, I wondered if he had always thought them. Maybe he believed I had been a passenger in my own life, carried entirely by the man I loved for 40 years. But yesterday, after leaving the funeral gathering early, I found something I was never meant to see. It was in the top drawer of my husband's desk, hidden beneath old insurance documents and utility bills. A letter. My name was not on the envelope. It was addressed to Daniel, our son. My hands had trembled as I broke the seal. I wish I could say I hesitated, that I honored the privacy between father and son. But something inside me needed to know, needed answers. The handwriting was shaky. My husband's final months had stolen his strength, but every word was still deliberate. "Son, I have one last piece of advice for you. Take care of your mother, even when she thinks she does not need it. She is stronger than she looks, but not as unbreakable as she pretends to be. I know she will try to be independent, but remember, she is the reason you are the man you are today. Don't let pride get in the way of gratitude." I read it again and again. Tears blurred the ink. My husband, even in his last days, had wanted to protect me not from bills or loneliness, but from the very attitude my son had shown me at his funeral. I sat in that office for hours, the sun moving from one side of the window to the other, reading and rereading that letter until the words felt etched into my bones. The irony was unbearable. My husband had entrusted Daniel with my care, and Daniel had decided to use the day of his father's burial to humiliate me. By the time the clock reached 4, I knew I could not let the letter sit quietly in that drawer. I called Daniel. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice already edged with annoyance. "Mom, I'm busy. I need to see you," I said. "Today." Silence on the other end. "About what?" "Your father." I kept my tone even, though my pulse was thundering. "And something he left behind for you." He sighed, like this was an inconvenience rather than a summons from his mother. "Fine, come by the house after dinner." That evening, I walked into his home, a place that had once been warm to me, but now felt hostile. His wife barely looked up from her phone as I entered. Daniel motioned toward the dining table but did not offer me a drink. I placed the letter on the table between us. "This was in your father's desk." He glanced at it but did not reach for it. So, you haven't read it," I said, though I already knew the answer. He shrugged. "If Dad wanted me to see it, he would have given it to me." I pushed it toward him. "Read it." For a moment, he stared at me, his jaw tightening. Then he picked it up and scanned the words. His eyes flickered as he read hesitation, discomfort, maybe even guilt. But when he finished, he set it down and leaned back in his chair. "This doesn't change anything," he said. I felt something snap inside me. "Doesn't change anything? Your father's dying wish was for you to take care of me, and you stood over his casket telling me I was nothing without him. Do you even hear yourself?" His wife looked up now, sensing the tension. "Maybe we should talk about this another time," she suggested, her voice laced with false sweetness. "No," I said sharply, my eyes never leaving Daniel's. "We talk about it now, because I am done pretending that what you said at the funeral was just grief talking. It wasn't. It was how you truly see me. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Mom, you've been acting like you can handle everything on your own. Dad did everything for you, and that's where you're wrong. I cut in. Your father and I built this life together, side by side. He may have earned the paycheck, but I kept this family standing when times got hard. I worked jobs you never knew about, paid bills before he could, and stayed awake through nights of worry when we thought we might lose the house. Do you think I did all that for my own pride? I did it for you. His face hardened, but there was a flicker, something like realization deep in his eyes. You think you know me, I continued, but you have been looking at me through the wrong lens your whole life. You saw the part of me that cooked dinner and smiled at your father's jokes. You didn't see the part that fought to keep the lights on when the oil business crashed, or the part that sat by your hospital bed when you were 12 and we didn't know if you'd make it through the night. Your father saw that part. That's why he wrote this letter. For the first time since I arrived, Daniel was quiet. His wife shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable. I stood, sliding the letter back toward him. Keep it. Read it again when you're ready. But understand this, your father's words are the truth. And the truth is that I am far more than nothing without him. I am everything he loved, and everything he trusted to keep going without him. I turned to leave, but paused at the door. The only question left, Daniel, is whether you want to be part of that life or watch it from a distance. The drive home was quiet. The letter had done its work, whether Daniel admitted it or not. I could feel it in the way he looked at me when I left a crack in the armor of whatever resentment he carried. That night, I placed the copy I had made of the letter back in my husband's desk, because one day, I knew Daniel would need to read it again, and maybe then, he would finally see me the way his father did. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Not the kind of peaceful quiet that comes after a long day, but the kind that feels like a weight pressing against your ears, reminding you that something is missing. It had been days since the funeral, but the echo of my son's words still lingered in the walls. You're nothing without Dad. He had said it like it was a fact carved in stone, like my existence outside of my husband's shadow was a mistake that had somehow slipped past the universe. I sat at the dining table, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before I ever took a sip. My hands rested on either side of it, my fingers tracing the chipped rim I had been meaning to replace for years. The cup had been part of a set we bought in the early days of our marriage, back when every purchase was an event, and every little thing felt like the beginning of a life we were building together. Now it was just me, sitting at the same table, with the same cup, in a house that no longer felt like mine. The phone had not rung in 3 days. My son had not called. My daughter-in-law had not sent so much as a message. Friends had left their polite condolences at the funeral and faded into their own lives. I could feel the distance growing, like a crack running through the foundation of my family. It was subtle at first, but once you saw it, you could not unsee it. I had thought grief would unite us. I had believed that losing him would make us cling to each other even more tightly. Instead, it felt as though his death had untied the knot, holding us together, and now the threads were unraveling faster than I could grab them. My son had taken on the role of the grieving patriarch, even though he was barely 35, and I had been cast in the role of the dependent widow, whether I wanted it or not. I rose from the table, abandoning the coffee, and walked into the living room. His chair was still there, facing the television, with a small indentation in the cushion where his body had shaped itself over years of evenings spent there. I had not moved it. I had not moved anything. The thought of rearranging the room felt like erasing him, and I was not ready for that. On the mantel sat a photo of our wedding day. I picked it up, my fingers brushing over the glass. We were so young then, standing under the oak tree with sunlight filtering through the leaves. His hand was on my waist, mine on his chest, both of us smiling like we knew we had the world ahead of us. I wondered what that young woman would say if she could see me now. Would she still be proud? Or would she pity the woman her son dismissed with a single sentence? A knock at the door startled me. It was sharp and quick, the kind of knock that carries urgency. I set the photo back on the mantel and made my way to the door. When I opened it, there was no one standing there. only a brown envelope lying on the porch. I bent to pick it up, my heart tightening as I saw my name written in my son's handwriting. Inside was a folded letter. My fingers hesitated before unfolding it, afraid of what I might read. The letter was short, too short. Mom, I think you should consider moving in with Aunt Linda for a while. The house feels too big for you now. It will be better this way. There was no "I love you," no "we'll talk soon," just those words and his signature. I sank onto the porch step, staring at the paper in my hands. It was not a suggestion. It was a decision made without me. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I could feel the cold creeping into the air, but I did not move. I sat there clutching the letter, and felt something inside me harden. If my son thought I was going to fade quietly into someone else's spare room, he was wrong. I had lived my life on my own terms before I met his father, and I could do it again. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt a spark. It was small, but it was there. I rose, went inside, and locked the door. The letter went into the drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. A reminder that I still had choices, even if my son wanted to believe otherwise. The house felt too quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that does not soothe but stings. I had been avoiding the study for days, afraid of what I might find there. It was my husband's room. His books, his papers, his handwriting still lingering on the corners of envelopes and the edges of newspapers. But after what had happened at the funeral, after the way my son had looked at me, spoken to me, I knew I needed to go in. There was unfinished business, and I had been putting it off for far too long. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the dust. Not the gentle layer that time leaves, but the thick, heavy kind that tells you the room has been sealed, untouched. My fingers ran along the desk, tracing a line through it. I could almost hear my husband clearing his throat behind me, the way he always did when he wanted to speak but was choosing his words carefully. I sat in his old leather chair, the one that creaked under the weight of years. There in the top right drawer was the envelope I had been searching for. My name in his handwriting. Not Mom, not Honey, not even my first name, just my name in full. As if this was a document, something official. My hands trembled. As I opened it, it was a letter, and behind it, a copy of his will. My eyes scanned the first few lines and froze. This was not the will I remembered signing with him at the lawyer's office. This one was dated only a year ago, and my son's name was circled in bold pen in the margin, as if someone had been drawing attention to it. My husband had left me the house, the savings, and the land just as we had agreed years before. But now, there were stipulations I had never seen. The land was to go to my son when his mother no longer resides there. The savings were to be managed jointly by him and me, with access to certain funds requiring both signatures. I read it twice, then a third time, my pulse pounding harder each time. This was not my husband's voice. This was not how he spoke, how he wrote, or how he thought. The man I knew believed in security for me above all else. He would never have placed my stability in someone else's hands, especially not in the hands of a son who had just told me I was nothing without his father. I thought of the months before my husband's death, how my son had visited more often, sometimes alone, sometimes with papers for his father to sign. I had assumed they were about the ranch business. I had not been allowed to sit in on those talks. My husband had said they were just men's discussions. At the time, I had let it go. I had trusted. Now, trust felt like a fool's currency I had been spending without checking the change. I folded the letter and the will back into the envelope, but I could not bring myself to put it away. Instead, I kept it in my lap, staring at the desk. There was something else here. I could feel it. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of old cattle ledgers, I found a small locked box. I remembered it from years ago. It was where my husband kept the deed to the house and other important papers. The key had always been in the third drawer, tucked inside a red velvet pouch. I reached for it, my hands moving almost automatically, muscle memory guiding me. The box clicked open. Inside were the papers I expected: deed, birth certificates, insurance policies. But there was also a small, spiral-bound notebook with the cover half torn away. I opened it and began to read. It was my husband's handwriting, but the tone was different. These were not business notes. They were thoughts, observations. The first entry I read was dated 3 weeks before he passed. James is pushing me again about the will. He says it's just a precaution, but I don't like the way he insists. I'm tired, and it's easier to agree, but I keep telling myself to wait. He says he wants to take care of his mother. I want to believe him. I felt my throat tighten. Another entry, dated 10 days later. He brought the lawyer here today. I signed the paper, but I am not sure I should have. My hands shook. I don't know why I didn't wait for her to be here. Maybe I thought it would cause a fight. I don't want to fight. Not now. I am so tired. By the time I closed the notebook, my hands were shaking so badly I had to set it down. The truth was no longer something I could pretend not to see. My son had maneuvered my husband into signing a will that gave him power over me, and my husband, weakened by illness and desperate to avoid conflict, had let it happen. I sat there in the study for a long time, watching the light shift on the wall. Every corner of the room felt heavier now. My husband had tried, in his way, to warn me. That notebook was his confession, his quiet way of leaving me the truth. I thought about confronting my son immediately, but I knew better. This was not a matter for a heated conversation over the phone. This was going to require preparation, patience, and precision. When I finally stood up, I took the envelope with the will, the notebook, and the key to the lockbox with me. They were no longer safe here. By the time I locked the study door behind me, the quiet no longer stung. It was not the quiet of loss anymore. It was the quiet before a storm, the kind that gathers in the distance, heavy with promise, and I was ready to be that storm. The day after the confrontation at my dining table, the house felt heavier than I had ever known. It was not just quiet. It was a silence that pressed against the walls, seeped into the floors, and made the air feel dense in my lungs. I woke before sunrise, not because I wanted to, but because sleep refused to come to me after the night's tension. I had replayed every word in my head. The way Daniel's voice had risen. The way Claire had crossed her arms like a courtroom prosecutor ready to convict me without evidence. The way my son had sat there, silent, letting his wife's words cut me open. I moved through the house like a stranger in a borrowed home. Every corner reminded me of my husband. The smell of his aftershave still clung to the hallway closet. The armchair in the living room still bore the slight indentation of his shape. I pressed my hand to it, and the memory of him reading his newspaper there came back so vividly that my chest tightened. He would have been furious to see how Daniel was speaking to me, not because of pride, but because of principle. My husband was a man who believed in respect above all things, and respect within a family was sacred to him. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, but the cup stayed untouched for a long while. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional groan of the house settling, and even those sounds seemed too loud in the emptiness. My mind kept going back to what my son had said at the funeral, the cruel, almost flippant statement that I was nothing without Dad. At the time, I had laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of hearing those words from my own child felt too surreal for any other reaction. But that laughter had not been understood. It had been taken as defiance, and maybe it was defiance, because I had lived a life before my husband. I had dreams, responsibilities, and strength before I even knew his name. And while his love had been the anchor that kept me steady, it had never been the definition of who I was. That my own son could not see, that could not remember the woman who raised him, fought for him, and loved him fiercely, was a grief that rivaled the loss of my husband. As I sat there, a knock at the door startled me. My heart leapt into my throat. Visitors had become rare, and my instincts told me this was not a friendly call. When I opened the door, there was Daniel, standing on the porch with a hard expression and a folded piece of paper in his hand. No hello, no softening of his eyes, just that paper which he thrust toward me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice low. A notice, he said simply. We've talked about this before. You can't keep living here alone. It's too much for you, and it's time to make some changes. I unfolded the paper and saw a legal letter. My son, my flesh and blood, had begun proceedings to force the sale of the house. The house his father and I had built. The house where I had brought him home from the hospital. The house where we had celebrated birthdays, Christmases, and countless little moments that made a life worth living. My hands trembled, but my voice did not. You think this is helping me? Daniel's jaw tightened. I think it's necessary. You won't listen. You're clinging to the past. Dad is gone, and you need to move on. Something inside me hardened at those words. He spoke as though my grief was an inconvenience, as though the memories in these walls were just clutter to be swept away. He didn't see that this house was not just a building. It was the proof of everything I had endured and everything I had loved. I stepped back from the door, not to let him in, but to put distance between us. I see, I said finally. You've made up your mind. Then so have I. Daniel looked momentarily unsure, as though he had expected me to beg or cry, but there were no tears. There was no plea for understanding. There was only a cold clarity settling in my bones. He left without another word, and I closed the door, locking it with a firmness that echoed in the empty rooms. I leaned against it, breathing in the stillness. I realized then that my son was no longer just misguided. He had chosen a path that placed his convenience above my dignity, and if he thought I would surrender quietly, he had forgotten who raised him. The tea on the table was cold now, but I drank it anyway. It was bitter, but it woke something in me, a resolve that had been sleeping for far too long. If this was the way my son wanted to go, then I would meet him on that path, but it would be on my terms. The evening after the confrontation, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the photographs spread before me. They were snapshots of my life, pieces of a puzzle I had been forced to put together alone after years of being told I was only half a person without my husband. My son's words at the funeral still hung in the air like smoke I could not clear, but now they no longer suffocated me. Instead, they drove me to a truth I had buried under years of family roles and silent sacrifices. A storm was rolling in. Outside, the Texas sky had turned an angry shade of purple, the kind that makes the air smell of wet earth before the first drop falls. I listened to the low rumble of thunder and wondered if maybe it was fitting nature itself was restless, just as I was. There was a time I would have called my son to check on him before a storm, making sure he was safe, that his windows were closed, that he had eaten. That night, I did not. That night, I poured myself a cup of strong coffee, sat back, and opened the old box my husband had left in the attic, the one I had been too afraid to touch until now. Inside were letters, receipts, and little notes that painted a picture of our life I had not fully understood. There was the electricity bill I paid in full when my husband had been out of work for months. There was the receipt for the engagement ring he had given me, one I had unknowingly paid for by selling my grandmother's brooch. And there were cards from my son when he was little, crayon drawings of me with "Best Mom" scrawled in uneven letters. I traced my fingers over them, remembering a time when his love was pure and uncomplicated. The storm broke outside, rain hammering against the windows. The sound was a steady drumbeat, matching the thud in my chest. I pulled out a letter, one from my husband to our son, written a year before he died. In it, he had written, "Your mother is stronger than you. No, she is the reason we have made it this far. If you learn anything from me, let it be to respect her." I read it twice, my breath catching on the second line. He had known. All those years of telling me I was his other half, he had also seen me as the whole foundation. And my son had been told. The bitterness I felt that my son had chosen to ignore those words burned hotter than the coffee in my mug. I thought of confronting him again, of shoving this letter into his hands and watching the arrogance drain from his face. But something inside me whispered that this was not about proving myself to him anymore. This was about reclaiming the space in my own mind that his words had invaded. The phone rang. It was my sister, her voice sharp with urgency. "I heard from a neighbor that he's been talking about you. she said. Telling people you're lost without your husband, that you can't manage the house, that you're unstable. The word hit me harder than I expected. Unstable. That was how he wanted to frame my independence, as a weakness, as something to pity. I laughed, a sound that startled both of us. It was not the laughter of someone amused, but of someone who had finally stopped caring about the small-minded narratives others created. Let him talk, I said. Every word he says now says more about him than me. After the call, I stood at the window, watching the rain turn the dirt road into a ribbon of mud. I realized that storms always left behind to things destruction and renewal. The destruction was obvious. Branches torn down, puddles swallowing the yard. But renewal came quietly. The smell of clean air, the shimmer of water on grass, the way the soil drank every drop. I decided that if my son saw me as nothing without my husband, then he was blind to the truth, and that blindness was his burden to carry, not mine. I was not a half. I was not a shadow. I was the storm and the calm after it. That night, I put away the letters, but not before slipping my husband's words into a frame for my mantle. A quiet reminder for myself, stronger than you know. And as the thunder rolled away, I understood that the weight of the truth was lighter than the weight of their lies. I stood there in the kitchen, the morning sun barely creeping through the blinds, when I heard the faint creak of the back door. My hands tightened on the coffee mug. No one had a key except me now, or at least that was what I thought. Who's there? My voice came out sharper than I intended. A figure stepped in, tall, lean, shoulders hunched, like he was already defeated before the conversation began. It was my son, Luke. He looked older than I remembered from just a month ago. His hair was messier, his shirt wrinkled, but his eyes still carried that same restless defiance. "Mama," he started, almost a whisper. "We need to talk." I wanted to laugh at the sudden politeness. This was the same boy who had stood in the church 2 months ago, at his father's funeral, and told me I was nothing without Dad. The same boy who had shoved his own mother into a corner of her life like an old chair that no longer fit the decor. "What could you possibly have to say to me, Luke?" I set the mug down with a deliberate clink. "I was wrong," he blurted out, words tumbling over themselves like he was afraid I would throw him out before he finished. "About everything. About you. About Dad. About the way I treated you." I did not move from my spot. I just watched him, letting the silence stretch long enough for him to feel every ounce of it. "Mama, I don't expect you to forgive me right away," he said, his hands twisting together. "But I didn't know the whole story. I didn't know what you went through to keep this family together while he swallowed hard. I was blind. It was strange how my chest ached at those words. Not with pity, but with the weight of years where I had hoped for this moment and convinced myself it would never come. "And why now?" I asked finally. "Why come walking through my door like this after all the things you said and did?" He hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. It was a folded letter, worn and creased like it had been opened and read over and over. He held it out. "It's from Dad," he said. The air in the kitchen shifted. My fingers tingled as I reached for it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, strong, deliberate strokes from a man who always wrote like he was carving the truth into paper. I unfolded it carefully, and as my eyes scanned the first lines, my knees almost gave way. Luke stepped closer. "I found it in Dad's toolbox. He wrote it before he got sick, Mama. He wanted me to read it, but I didn't until last week." The words in the letter were not an apology, they were a confession. My husband had known the cracks in our marriage, the sacrifices I made, and he had told Luke in plain terms that if he ever disrespected me, he would be dishonoring his father's greatest regret. When I looked back up, Luke's face was wet. "I treated you like you were just his shadow, when all along you were the one holding us in the light." I felt a lump in my throat, but I stood straighter. "Luke, you cannot undo years with one visit and one letter. But if you are here to make things right, you better understand it's going to take more than words." "I know," he said, nodding quickly. "I'll do whatever it takes." For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of the boy I had raised, the one who used to run barefoot in the Texas dirt, chasing after nothing but the joy of the moment. Still, I was not ready to soften. Not yet, then start, I said. Not tomorrow, not next week. Start now. He straightened his shoulders like a soldier accepting his orders. Yes, Mama. The room felt lighter somehow, though the past still clung to us both. And as he stepped toward the sink to wash the coffee mugs, I realized this was not the end of our story. It was the beginning of a reckoning, one I had waited my whole life for. The morning after my quiet but victorious return to the house, I woke up to the sound of birds outside my bedroom window. It was the first time in weeks that the air in my lungs didn't feel heavy. My late husband's photo sat on the dresser, his eyes frozen in that same mischievous smile. I picked it up and whispered, "We made it, Robert." Downstairs, the sun poured through the kitchen window, painting the old wooden table gold. I made coffee the way I always had, strong, black, and served in the chipped blue mug Robert had given me for our 15th anniversary. I wasn't just making coffee, I was reclaiming my rhythm. Every spoonful of sugar in the jar, every creak in the floorboard, every familiar scent of the old place was mine again. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. The phone rang before I could even finish my first sip. It was my lawyer, Mr. Harris. His tone was measured, but I could hear the satisfaction in it. "Margaret," he said, "your son has signed the relinquishment agreement. The house is officially yours. Permanently." I thanked him, though my throat tightened. It wasn't joy exactly, but something deeper: relief, dignity, a quiet justice. I hung up and sat still for a moment, letting the news settle in. That afternoon, I decided to tackle the porch. The very same porch where, months ago, I had found my belongings packed into boxes with a cruel note. I remembered the sting in my chest when I saw them, how my hands shook as I read those careless words. Standing there now, broom in hand, I realized I was sweeping away more than dust. I was clearing out the last remnants of humiliation. Around 3, a truck pulled into the driveway. My neighbor, Helen, stepped out, holding a casserole in a glass dish. She didn't even ask if she could come in. She just wrapped her arms around me. "We all heard what happened," she said. "Good for you." She placed the casserole on my counter, then sat with me for tea. We didn't talk much about the ugliness, just about the weather, her garden, and the upcoming church fair. But there was an unspoken understanding between us. She knew I had walked through a storm and come out standing. 2 days later, I got the letter. It was from my son. The handwriting was hurried, unfamiliar. He apologized in a way, though it wasn't the kind of apology that erased what had been done. He claimed he had been under pressure, that grief had clouded his judgment, that he'd been manipulated by others. I read it twice and set it down. I didn't feel anger anymore. Not like before. But I also didn't feel the need to open the door wide for him again. Boundaries were not cruelty. They were protection. I wrote him back, short and clear. I wished him well, but I told him I would be keeping my distance until trust was rebuilt, if it ever could be. That night, I sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the sun disappear behind the Texas hills. I thought of Robert, of the life we had built brick by brick, laugh by laugh, sacrifice by sacrifice. I thought of how quickly someone else had tried to erase it, and how I had refused to let that happen. I wasn't nothing without Dad, as my son had once spat at me. I was a woman who had loved deeply, fought quietly, and stood her ground when the earth beneath her feet shifted. I had been a wife, a mother, a caretaker, but I was also still Margaret, and that was enough. When the stars came out, I whispered a promise to myself. This house would be filled again, not with people who took, but with people who understood the value of what they had been given. Friends, neighbors, maybe even family if the time was right. But until then, it would be my sanctuary. And so, on that final night of this chapter, I turned off the lights, locked the door, and climbed the stairs with a quiet smile. I had walked through fire and found my way home again.